Ridge started making wine from here actually in the winter of 71, 72 when Paul Draper, who had just become the winemaker in 1969, still quite a few years ago, was up on a rainy winter day over at the Nervo winery tasting room, which is no longer there in Alexander Valley. He happened upon a fellow, Richard Sherwin, who had just purchased a property and with vines on it, didn't know what to do. So Paul, being Paul, said, well, let's go have a look. Pouring rain, they drove out to Lytton Springs Road to Chiquita Road. Paul took one look at these old vines, which were, 40 years younger back then, but still old vines, and said, I'll buy the fruit. He then named that the 72 Lytton Springs Zinfandel from Ridge, and it was a great wine. It won accolades, especially in New York, Manhattan, and we were in the Lytton Springs Zinfandel business. In 1977, Dick Sherwin decided that he wanted to get into the wine business, so he built a winery on this property and took the grapes away from Ridge for about 5 years, and very graciously asked Paul if he could use the name Lytton Springs, so Lytton Springs Winery was born in 1977. Well, then 5 years later, 1982, Bill Hambrecht happened to buy a ranch just next door to this, and Paul was able to buy some fruit from him, and so Ridge was back into the Lytton Springs game because Paul then asked Dick if he could name it Lytton Springs, the wine Lytton Springs, and Dick was a good businessman, and he knew that too many names were not a problem with that to get recognition. So there was a Ridge Lytton Springs, and there was a Lytton Springs Winery, Dry Creek Valley Zinfandel. So then in 1991, a few years later, Dick Sherwin decided that he wanted to focus on Cabernet Sauvignon in Mendocino County, and wanted to sell this property. So we bought it for the vines, not for the little winery that was on it. But it turns out that we have, since then, about 10 years later, we started turning the winery into something that Paul had always wanted to do, and build a production facility dedicated to Zinfandel that could take all the fruit from Lytton Springs. And so that's what we have, where we'll be tasting the wine this afternoon. That's the kind of above ground cave that Paul kind of conceptualized and had built for him. It's a straw bale building with stucco being composed of clay from our soils here, straw, and some sand, adobe style building that works really well for Zin. And it's pretty much a Zin house, although we do some Petite Sirah there. We do a little Carignan, another varietal grape here that we typically blend in with Zin. But the heart of what we do as Ridge as a winery is kind of split into two, but the biggest part of it is Zinfandel. And most of our Zinfandel comes from our own vineyards here in Alexander Valley and Dry Creek Valley, and we're right here in Dry Creek Valley. And that's about half of our Zin production is what we do is Dry Creek Valley.
And David, how long have you been with Ridge?
I've been with Ridge since 1989.
And you're viticulturalist?
Yeah, I'm the Vice President of Vineyard Operations for Ridge.
We're sitting here in what specific vineyard? What is this vineyard?
So we call this what we call this vineyard is Lytton Estate East. And it is the heart of our Lytton Springs Zinfandel, Zin blend that we make here, and we've been making since that first vintage in 1972. This particular vineyard was planted in 1902. It is mixed, which is very typical of vineyards pre-prohibition. This is on the conservative side of mixed plantings back then. It's about 95% Zinfandel in the flats here where we are standing. The rest of between 90 and 95% Zin. The other varieties that are mixed in there are very typical of pre-prohibition mixed plantings. It's Alicante Boucher, there's Mataro or Mourvedre, which is actually Monastral. There's a little bit of that. There's Carignan, there's Petite Sirah, there's, Grand Noir, which is another similar to Alicante. It's a Teinturier, red juice variety. There's some whites. The predominant white that we have is called Burger. The correct name for that is Montauban, I think it is. It's a very common grape for sherry, and very commonly interplanted here in old vineyards like this. So that's a few of you'll find a Syrah here and there. And on the hills in the background, those vines were planted in 1910, and they're a little bit different mix. They're only about 60% Zinfandel, and most of that Zin is up on the very tops of the hills. On the sides of the hills is predominantly Petite Sirah or Grenache on one hill, and it's a nice mix.
We're standing here on August 17th, 2011, and could you just briefly summarize, from the viticulturist point of view, how this growing season has developed so far?
Wet and late. It's wet because we've had a lot of rain. We had a very generous winter of rain, and then to top it off, in early June we had 3¼ inches here, which we didn't really need, but we'll take it. It solved the drought problem that we have in California. It also exacerbated the weed issues that we always deal with in vineyards, but it's really helped the vines out. It's letting them grow really well. It affected the rain affected the bloom and set of the vines a little bit, so that the clusters are a little smaller, a little less full, which means that we don't need to thin this year. It's a late year, but it's not as late as last year, so everything's relative, right? We are about 2 weeks behind normal, so for us that means that we'll be picking these grapes probably in another month. If you see on the vines here, they are just finishing up veraison, so they're just turning from green to soft, black grapes. And when that happens, you usually have between 4 and 6 months or weeks to go before harvest. So my anticipated beginning of the vintage is the middle of September.
Great. So now we'll go taste some wine that came from this vineyard.
Yeah, that'll be fun. That's what it's all about.